Hello, I'm Javis Lewis, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the DAZ Studio Photoshop Bridge. That's a little tool that comes with DAZ Studio that lets you import and export image maps and do all kinds of other funky things between the two programs. The bridge itself is a few years old, so it may appear a little bit old school and clunky, but it still has its uses. Some options are there that don't really work, but it's one of those things. I will show you how it works, and you be the judge of if you want to use it in your workflow or not. So what we'll discuss today are basically three things. The first one is how to render from DAZ Studio directly into Photoshop. This allows you to bypass the step where you want to perhaps render out a character from DAZ Studio with a transparent background, and save that as a PNG image, and then import it into Photoshop and composite a background to the same picture. So you can save yourself the step of saving that image. You can render it directly into Photoshop. So we'll speak about how to do that. The other important thing that the bridge allows us to do is to import and export texture maps from our 3D objects. So if you want to do some texturing for a character or for a piece of clothing or for anything else that you've done in DAZ Studio, then you can import textures directly into Photoshop, make changes, and at the click of a button, bring those back and make them appear in DAZ Studio. And last but not least, we're going to speak about installation and troubleshooting options. So there's a couple of pitfalls that happen. The bridge is always updated when there's a new version of DAZ Studio that comes out, but at the same time Photoshop is also updated regularly, and that can sometimes cause a little hitch or two. So if it's not working as I'm showing you this here, then we'll speak about troubleshooting, and perhaps there's something that you can fix on your system. The tools we use for all this are DAZ Studio 4.9, or rather 4.9.2.70 to be exact. I'm also going to be using Photoshop CC 2015 release 1.2, and I'm doing this on a Mac with El Capitan 10.11.6. Just to let you know, I'm recording this video in July 2016, so if you're watching it in 10 years time and all the menus have changed, you think, hey, what's going on here? That's because the video at that point will be 10 years old, and things change rather quickly. Anyway, with all that out of the way, let's get creative. I've already opened DAZ Studio and Photoshop. Both programs obviously need to be open at the same time for all this magic to happen. And I'm going to pick an item of clothing by 3D Universe that comes with the Alexis character, and that's this one here, the Alexis camisole. So I'm going to double click that to load it into my scene. And perhaps frame it up. Nothing else needs to be in the scene if you just want to texture this one item. You can have other items in the scene, and all anything that's in the scene will be either rendered into Photoshop, or if you're texturing, then all the image maps will potentially be imported into Photoshop. So to get this thing going, head over to File and find the Initialize Photoshop 3D option here. If this isn't there under File, then that means the Photoshop Bridge is not installed. So head over to the Install Manager in that case and install it. So click it, and what you'll notice is that DAZ Studio has created a new camera. So our perspective has changed, our viewport has changed from what used to be the perspective view into the 3D Bridge camera. And it just does that because it needs a camera to render. You can frame it up, or in fact you should frame it up if you want to render this item. Let's have a front, 3/4 front view here. And that's all you need to do in DAZ Studio for now. Position your item if you want to do rendering, load additional elements into the scene if you want to do rendering. If you want to do texturing, that's all you really need to do. No lighting required. Head over to Photoshop and open a new document. Perhaps I'll use a 1024 by 1024 image, in this case with a transparent background, and head over to File, Automate, and find the DAZ Studio 3D Bridge option. Again, if you don't see this option and you're sure the bridge is installed, the path may be incorrect in Install Manager to your Photoshop installation. We'll talk about that at the end of the video. So if this item is there, click it, and you'll see that this little extra floating panel comes up. And this allows us to interact with DAZ Studio, more or less. Certain options are here that don't really make a lot of sense. So you can close DAZ Studio from here if that's something you want to do. The option works, which is good. Not all options work here. The bottom item here, close, means just close the floating panel. And then if you have done that, you can just bring it back with File, Automate, and bring back the DAZ Studio 3D bridge this way. For rendering, let's talk about rendering first. If you want to render directly into Photoshop, the first thing you need to do is hit Preview Image. And as soon as you do, another little mini floating panel comes up, which allows you to specify what size you'd like to render the image at. I will leave it at the default 600 by 800, but feel free to change it. Click Import, and Photoshop will create a new layer here, or rather the bridge script will create a new layer. I don't really know why, I must be honest, because it's not really used for anything, or in the current version of the bridge, this doesn't really do anything. So you could go ahead and delete this. We may do that later. But notice that a couple of options have popped up here that were previously grayed out. One is Update Image, one is Enable Auto Update. These two options sadly don't work, no matter how hard I try. These probably have worked in a previous version of the bridge many years ago, but they no longer work. And I believe they were meant to be used for if you make a change in your scene, then that with Auto Update or with Update Image, this change would be reflected in the current Photoshop document. Doesn't work anymore, so please ignore this. The only thing that does work is Render to New Layer. And if you click that, then there's a little pause here. Certain items are grayed out. That's because now DAZ Studio is hard at work rendering your image. And a few seconds later, said image is going to pop up in your document. Well, that's very cool. So I suppose in a previous life, you could go back to DAZ Studio and perhaps render a different angle of the same image, head back over to Photoshop and click Update Image, and that was supposed to update this with the new render. Doesn't work anymore. Same with Enable Auto Update, doesn't work anymore. But again, what does work is Render to New Layer. So you can click that again, and again, DAZ Studio will go ahead and render that image again from the new perspective, and as soon as it's ready, here it is on a new layer. So now we have two layers with two images, and obviously it's not really good having them on top of each other, so let's separate them out. And there we have it, clothing item rendered from two separate viewpoints. And the cool thing now is we can create a new layer, or just use this one here, and for example, pick a color, something like this, and for example, create a gradient and composite your 3D image onto a 2D background. So if you already have a background and you want to render a character into it, then that's as easy as that. You can load lights into your DAZ Studio scene. You can load maybe background elements if you like, and then just bring that into Photoshop directly and play around with it. If the character needs to be a little bit larger or a little bit smaller or needs to be shown from a different angle, you do all these things in DAZ Studio until you're completely happy. And then you head over to Photoshop and render this as a new layer, and there you go. So that's one thing, directly rendering into Photoshop. The other option that we have is importing the image maps. If you want to create a new texture for this clothing item or for a character or for anything else, you can import texture maps directly into Photoshop. And believe it or not, that's what the Import Image Maps button does. So if you click it, another floating little panel pops up here. Goes off the screen a little bit. Right now I seem to have two items that I can import here. One is the Alexis Camisole texture file, and the other one is an HDR file, which is for the ambient lighting in the scene. I don't actually know where that comes from. You can either tick this box here, select all, that's already ticked by default, and that means Photoshop will take all the images that it can and bring it over, or you can untick it and only select one of them. It's one of those things to be aware of. It's ticked by default, and that may not be what you want if you have a full character and maybe other scene elements. There could be several dozen images that could end up in Photoshop, many of which we don't need. But it's not an issue because we can close them down as soon as they come over. So let me bring everything over, hit import, and Photoshop goes to work, and here we go. This is the active document, the Alexis camisole. And this one was the HDR image that we don't really need anymore, so I'm going to close that down. And this texture allows me now to make changes. Often we can see the UVs here. In this case, they're not quite obvious, so I can only assume that this is probably the middle front of my item. In fact, let me just create a new layer and grab a brush and just make a test mark on here. So I suppose this is the front. The back is probably here and there where the seams meet. And I would imagine maybe this is the right-hand side here. And this is probably the left-hand side. Just a guess. But it's one of those things. I can work on a new layer, I can make changes, I can add flood fills, I can add embellishments, anything I want. And then simply hit export image maps again. And again, it will allow me to select what I'd like to send back to DAZ Studio. In this case, I don't want to select all because I've got my untitled document open, so I don't want to send everything over. I just want to send this one. Unselect, select all, and hit export. And with a bit of luck, in DAZ Studio, we now have my changes of my new texture applied. And I was indeed correct. This is the front, this is the left, and this is the right. But here's a hitch. If you think, hey, that was really convenient, maybe I'll go back to Photoshop and make another change. And perhaps, I don't know, just create a box around this, just so that we know something has changed. And I hit export image maps again, go through the same thing, just select the one you want, unselect, select all, and export. Or in fact, if you want to make your life a bit easier, just close any other documents like this one. Don't want to save this. So hit export image maps and go back to DAZ Studio and think, hey, where are my changes? It worked so well a minute ago and right now it didn't work. Perhaps I made a mistake. You go back, you hit export image maps again. You think, hey, let me try again. Perhaps it didn't take it for whatever reason. You're not mad, it just doesn't work. It works once and only once. It doesn't export image maps, it doesn't work more than once. So sorry, DAZ Studio Bridge, it's not quite what we had expected from your high quality standards. Luckily, there is a very simple workaround that you can employ to just not use the export image maps button, and that is the following. If you have your document ready, just save it as a PSD file. File save as, and Photoshop will offer to save it in the original folder where the original file is, which by the way is unchanged, in case you're worried about the fact that now that you've made a change, perhaps this is now burnt into the original file of the Alexis camisole. Fret not, it is not. It is saved as a separate document. But let me go to my desktop and save this as say new camisole. So that's a PSD file inclusive of layers, which is good. And now in DAZ Studio, under the Surfaces tab, select your item of clothing and head over to the diffuse color, which currently has this temporary file here. This is, in my case, this is called Alexis camisole _df007. So this is the name that Photoshop gave it when I exported it. And I suppose 008 was supposed to be the one that I exported afterwards. Kind of didn't work, but one of those things. Hit this little arrow here, browse to your PSD file that we've just saved here on the desktop. It was new camisole. And just apply that. And that's where our changes are now live. And the good thing about that is if you now go back to Photoshop and make another change, so for example, perhaps I didn't like what I did here, create a new layer, switch this layer off, even take a different color, and pick my brush and draw a big smiley face on it or something. All you need to do is hit Command S or Control S, which is the equivalent of going to File, Save, which I've just done with, that's why it's grayed out. And if you head back to DAZ Studio, seconds later, your changes are actually applied. So that's a much easier way to bring textures back from Photoshop into DAZ Studio. The import textures works fine, but export is just, an option that doesn't quite work as we would like. In case this doesn't show up, you can, under the Surfaces tab, you can head over to this little tab here. Another context menu pops up, and check that this option is ticked, automatically refresh images. So anytime you make a change to an image, so save a change, then this should be automatically populated. If that isn't the case, you can use this option here, refresh images, and that'll make sure your changes are applied. Two options we haven't spoken about here are these two here, export scene as U3D and export scene as DAE. Now DAE is the Collada format and U3D is the Universal 3D format. Let's start with Collada first. It's not quite obvious what these things do unless you try them out. Click it, the DAE, so that asks DAZ Studio to export the current scene as a Collada scene and import it straight back into Photoshop as a 3D object. That's an interesting option, even though Collada, for me, doesn't seem to really work. But hey, that's Collada for us. Let's close this document. And it'll work much better with the Universal 3D. However, we have to go back to DAZ Studio and just confirm certain settings. Let's try that. Universal 3D, off you go. The bridge quickly halts, and that means you have to switch back into DAZ Studio, and it just wants to know what the maximum size of the maps is. Accept the defaults, hit accept. DAZ Studio will export this, and if you head back into Photoshop, you will now see that 3D object from DAZ Studio in Photoshop. Now there's a lot of 3D features in Photoshop, and I guess we'll discuss that in another video because they are so, well, there's just so many of them. So I'll dedicate a whole video to how to use the 3D features in Photoshop. But that is what these two options do. They ask DAZ Studio to export the current scene and import it straight back into Photoshop so that you can, texture using the built-in 3D options in Photoshop. Let's talk about troubleshooting for a second. If you don't see the option of either initiating the Photoshop bridge in DAZ Studio or in Photoshop, then there's two things that you can check. Open your DAZ Install Manager and have a look in the search field here under Ready to Download. Just type in, if you can spell, Photoshop or Photoshop Bridge, or just Photo. I suppose Photoshop is cool. If you find something under Ready to Download, like the Photoshop 3D Bridge, in this case this is a beta version, then tick it and install it. Tick it and hit Start the queue. In my case, I don't want to do that. I'm not using the new beta version of the bridge. If you instead have a look under Installed, and you find that the Photoshop 3D Bridge is installed, then it is definitely installed. So DAZ Studio should show up the option. If under Installed you see nothing, and under Ready to Download you find the bridge, then go ahead and install it. If you find two bridges, like in my case, I have the one for the public beta and for the official release, then there's a way that you can, under Download Filters, you can show beta versions as well. That's public build and private build here. Those two, if you untick those, then you don't see the beta versions. Or if you'd like to participate in beta versions, then, tick these two things. Publishing build is the one that's the general release. So that's one thing to check. If your bridge is installed under the Install tab, that's cool. If the bridge is not showing up in Photoshop under File Automate, then it could be that the path to Photoshop in Install Manager is wrong. So that when the bridge installs, it puts some files into the Photoshop directory, and of course they need to be placed in the correct path. Then, if that's not the case, then Photoshop won't see that menu item. And to make sure it does, there's this little icon up here that you can tick, and head over to Applications. And in here you can see Photoshop multiple times. In my case, there's an old version of Photoshop that I have, which is CS5, and I also have the Photoshop CC version here. And this will reveal the path, these little 3 dots here. If you tick that, then it will reveal which path to Photoshop the Install Manager is using. Now the thing is, on a Mac, it works similarly on Windows. There's a folder on the Mac that's called Applications, and in here you have the folders for Adobe Photoshop. Under Windows it's called Program Files, I believe. And what may happen from time to time is that when a new version of Photoshop comes out, Adobe install that in a new folder. So the path to Photoshop changes. Sometimes it's overwritten, like in the latest version of Photoshop CC 2015, the 1.1 release was in the same folder as the 1.2 release, but Photoshop CC 2014 was in a completely different folder, so hence the path had changed. So make sure the Install Manager is seeing the correct path here, and if it is not, amend it. And then hit Accept. And if you already had the Photoshop Bridge installed and it wasn't working, under the Install tab, tick it and uninstall it, and then install it again with the new path, and that'll save you, hopefully, some hassle. That was it. I hope you liked the video. If you did, please share it with friends, family, and total strangers, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Bye for now. I will see you next time.